is my honor, profound honor, to be able to teach a class with, think with, um, raise up Bethune with someone who I know loves her
And
deeply.
likewise, we have been having a wonderful time teaching this class. We want to talk to you all a little bit about what we're teaching. And it's been an honor to work with you also. I never imagined that we would be able to come up with something like this class. And the way that the students have been inspired by Mrs. Bethune. I mean, we had a student after class on Thursday who wants to change their major to history. I have a student who came to me the other day and she said, it's really been on my mind, this whole idea of not for myself, but for others, which is something that Mrs. Bethune said very often. And for her to just be contemplating that, I think it really shows the power of Mrs. Bethune. And so before we get into this conversation, I just want to say that I always call her Mrs. Bethune. There's a story behind the why. She was at an event and the person announced Mary Bethune will take the stage now. And she came to the microphone and she said, let the record reflect Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune will now take the stage. So I'll always call her Mrs. Bethune. Thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Hobbs, the friends of the library, everyone. We're really glad to be in Florida. No matter where you do this work, doing it in Florida is always very special. So I guess
I
we can
think we're
get
gonna, yeah,
into
we're
the
gonna
why.
start off. You want to start, or
You can
do
start
it?
with
Okay,
the why.
we're just gonna talk a little bit about how we both came to research Bethune. So I grew up part time in Florida. My parents got divorced when I was 5, and their custody arrangements had me going back and forth between Clearwater, Florida, and San Francisco, California. So my grandparents and my father lived in Clearwater. And then my mother and her people lived in San Francisco. So I bounced back and forth. For the Florida portion, so I claim Florida as hard as I do San Francisco. I spend as much time here. Uh, but the Florida grandparents, there was a table against a wall that had my grandmother's most precious photographs on it. They were the ones, we had photo albums all over the place. She had photos hanging all over the place. But the ones on this little table in the living room were I somehow came to understand the most precious to her. Um, and Mrs. Bethune was not on this collection of family photographs when my grandparents got married. My father in his first set of long pants. My father at his first, he played the violin. So it was, him playing the violin. My first birthday party, right? Like there were all of these moments that I knew mattered. On top of this table was an image of Mary McLeod Bethune hanging on the wall, not down on the table. Um, and so I mean, I learned to walk pulling myself up on this table. I walked by it regularly. So I always thought I knew who Mary McLeod Bethune was. My grandmother went to Bethune Cookman. My grandfather organized with her in the Florida State Teachers Association, as well as got advice for a organization that he and Harriet Moore founded, the Progressive Voters League. So she was always around in their lives. Um, and so when I had someone ask me who, if I could write about anyone I wanted to write about, I always say I don't know exactly where it came from. The response being Mary McLeod Bethune. I literally picked up the phone one day and my agent was like, anybody, just pick a person you could write. And I was like, in response to what? How long? What is the context? And she was like, don't worry about that. Just tell me who you would most want to write about if you could write about anybody. And I forgot who I said first, and she was like, "That's Dole." So I was like, "So you don't mean anybody? Like you got some kind of idea?" And the person that I said was Mary McLeod Bethune, and she was like, "Okay, hold on." And she got off the phone, called Skip Gates, and was like, "She want to write about Mary McLeod Bethune." Skip was like, "Fine." This is how this book came to be written. But she writing this book at this time profoundly reordered my sense of the possible in terms of Black politics. It profoundly, in ways like different from just running by and seeing someone or hearing people talk about what it is to be great, what it is to be committed. The title of my book, um, A Passionate Mind in Relentless Pursuit, I was struck by the um, the grace, the love, the care that she brought to organizing, that she brought to children, that she brought to women. I was struck by her as a political um, theorist. I mean, she had a theory for change. She had ideas that were well articulated about what it means to move uh, under conditions that would best be described as fascism in the Jim Crow South at that period of time, where there's an unequal citizenship baked in that you can't do anything about for most of the period that she was alive. She died in 1955. How you navigate that, how you inspire and love and care in the midst of those conditions while you're asking people to sacrifice, to come together, to lift up, is a theory of politics, is not just a great educator who knew some things, which is how I often, people will just say she was an educator, she's a preeminent educator, and she was. She was, and that's no small thing, but she was so, so, so much more. So yeah, that's how I came to write about her. That's what I came to know.
So I was a student at Howard University, first year PhD program. And my idea was that I would do a dissertation on the Black Panther Party. That's what I was thinking. And I was in class, and Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis, one of my colleagues now, but my professor at the time, began to talk to us about public history. And I said, "Oh, wow, that sounds interesting." She talked about archives, working in museums, and I said, "Wow, okay." She said, "You could get a job." So I went to her office the next day, changed my minor to public history. And she said, "You need to go down to the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House and volunteer or intern, one of those things." So I went down to the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House and met with Dr. Joy Kennard, and she gave me a tour of the house, and behind the house was the archive. And she said, "Well, which one do you want to volunteer in?" And I said, "Well, I think I want to try the archive." I didn't know anything about an archive, honestly. And I started in the archives as a volunteer. They offered me a job a few months later, and it was amazing. It didn't feel like work. I was processing different collections. I was working with researchers who were learning about Mrs. Bethune and other folks in her orbit, kind of at the National Archives for Black Women's History. And I really just fell in love with her story. And so from there, when I was looking for a dissertation topic, again, I thought about the Black Panther Party, and Dr. Clark Lewis always says to drop down your bucket where you are. And I was doing African diaspora, and I saw these connections. The first two things I saw was that she visited Haiti in 1949 and that she went to Liberia in 1952. And so from there, I began to really investigate all of the international work that she did. And that's where the dissertation came from, which ultimately became the book. And thereafter, I went to her home in Daytona Beach, Florida, and worked there for 5 years, running her home. And it was an amazing experience to meet people who knew Mrs. Bethune. Her grandson, Albert McLeod Bethune Jr., he passed away in 2017, I believe, and he was 96. He talked about his grandmother. He talked about not really understanding who she was until she passed away, and he was 32 when she passed away. He talked about traveling with her. Mr. Harold Lucas, who is in both of them are in my first book. He talked about what it was like when she was the president and how she would walk around the campus, and he would walk with her, and she would say, "Pick up that little trash over there because somebody might come by the campus and see that trash, and they might not want to give us a donation. Like she was so particular about everything like that. Bethune-Cookman College, now university, was her baby, and her house sat in the middle of the campus. Miss Senorita Locklear, who just turned 100 yesterday, she's another person that I met and interviewed, and she was Miss Bethune's secretary. And she talked about what it was like to work for her. And she talked about the last day that she was alive and 3 requests that she made. One of them was to read over her will again. And another one was to read the book that she was working on with Rackham Holt. She said she had heard all the chapters individually, but she wanted to hear all of them together. And then there's one more request, but you'll have to read the book to get the request. But, you know, it's almost as if she knew that she was going to pass away that day and she was getting her affairs in order. And so to come from DC and working in her house and in the archives there to running the home in Daytona, but meeting so many folks who actually knew her, it just gave me a different experience and a different understanding of who she was. And there's so many things that I learned that I think I would have never known, just being a researcher and just doing the work from a distance. But being there and seeing people who knew her, learning about her favorite food, smothered chicken wings and grits, you know, it was just an amazing experience. And so the book started as a dissertation and it ultimately became a book. But the 10 years in between graduation and the publication of this book, there's so many experiences that helped me to really, I guess, clarify my message in the Mary McLeod Bethune, the Pan-Africanist. So that's my experience, and that's I guess, the way that I came into this work. Very different from knowing her and seeing her picture on the on the coffee table.
I think we wanted to both just sort of share something that we learn that's deeply important. Um, so the structure of my book, I should say, it is not a straight ahead biography by any stretch. It's me making sense of uh, me growing up in Florida and her significance in that context. Florida is a very, I mean, every state is a very particular ecosystem. Since I claim this at home as home, you know, I'm all like, yes, it's very complicated, and you need to be here from under. I'm sure every state feels like that, but so mine has what am I calling it? Like a biomythography. It's as much memoir as it is biography of Bethune. I bounce back and forth between the two, and one of the things that I bounce back and forth around led me to think about this thing I'm calling Black capitalism. Um, which I'll explain like this. So, my grandparents bought a place in American Beach, Florida, which is right outside of Jacksonville. Uh, they bought it in the 1940s. It was a community, American Beach, founded by the first uh, A.L. Lewis, who was Abraham Lincoln Lewis. That is an aspirational name, right? Like Abraham Lincoln Lewis. Uh, he founded the Afro American Life Insurance Company, which went on to make him a millionaire. He was a descendant of enslaved people, as most Southern Black folks were, and is kin to Johnetta Cole, who I know will be here in the not too distant future. So uh, this community was the fruit of, it was the result of a vision of Black people across a social strata needing to have a place where they could come and feel safe. As you well know, I know you know if you walk through here because I saw something on the walls about the segregated beaches in Florida. I think there's something like 2,100 miles of coastline. In the 1940s, when American Beach was founded, there was only about 20 miles of coastline that Black people had any claim to. And the thinking was the motto for American Beach was relaxation without harassment. Without humiliation, yes. Relaxation without humiliation, because consistently, when Black people showed up, we tell this story in the 60s very often. Like this story is sort of Black people in water and beaches and segregation. You will hear some about, but it starts in the 60s. It's actually much earlier. Um, oh, it's actually much earlier that that's happening, and both Abraham Lincoln Lewis and Mary McLeod Bethune is in response to this idea that joy was not something that Black people had a right to expect, that relaxation was not something that Black people should think that they could expect. In the state of Florida, founded beaches. Um, but they did it in very different ways. With A.L. Lewis, and the reason I'm calling it Black capitalism is it was a group of Black people who by and large made their money from Black communities. Um, and they decided to take the pension fund from the insurance company to leverage the pension fund to buy real estate so that everyone from secretaries to executives could own some property. They were very inexpensive lots, and it was almost in a way a kind of utopian. This idea that we're going to be together, and it was American Beach was the place to be. BB King, and like yeah, my father used to tell me stories about um, the draw that it really was. So it was Black people taking their money in order to support Black people. I'm just calling that Black capitalism. So it's money that was made in a capitalistic system, but put to use in a different kind of way to empower. And Mrs. Bethune also starts a beach, and she pulls together. She has funding from the Afro American Life Insurance Agency. A.L. Lewis serves on the board of the Bethune Beach. What was it called? I just always call it Bethune Beach. Was it that it was incorporated as Bethune Beach? And Bethune Beach. Uh, this is the thing that blew my mind when I first started researching it. Actually, had in its charter that this was a beach for Black people, that only Black people were to own property on this beach when it was initially founded. As when she pulled it together and incorporated it, the folks who were on this board, again, saw this as an act of support for Black folks. She was not a separatist by any stretch of the imagination. You know, she's worked in the Roosevelt administration for a number of years. It wasn't that she didn't believe in integration, but there was something about a beach and land and opportunity for Black people, funded by Black people, that she thought was a part of a political future that we needed to take seriously. Because to not take seriously ownership, who owns, what are you funding? One of her biographers, who's an unreliable biographer, Rackman Holt, but she did write, like, she's a little unreliable, however she wrote a whole biography. She tells this story that I don't even know if it's true about this the term the white man's ice is colder. So what Rackman Holt says, Mrs. Bethune said about this is that there was a following World War II, there was a military person who came back, couldn't find work, was trying to figure out what to do with himself. Ms. Bethune was like, well, why don't you start your own business? I'll give you a few dollars and you can start your own business. And they decided he was going to start an ice delivery business. So he bought whatever equipment that he took these startup funds. I'm sort of like she was providing venture capital for the startup funds. He took this money, bought him a truck, got his son to kind of help. They went and bought big blocks of ice. Of course, this is the time we had an ice pick, and all you basically did was chip off pieces that people would put in their refrigerators, etc. So he's doing this in the Black community. He starts doing very well. Previously, the ice had been delivered by Italian folks who were in the area, and it takes off, and he does well. He starts to expand. So Ms. Bethune comes to him and says, "So how did things go? It seems like things are going very well. I'm happy for you." And he says there's some version of, "Well, yeah, everybody. It was just one woman. One woman refused to buy my ice, but everybody else, thank you so much. I'm expanding. This is great." So Ms. Bethune decided to go ask the woman, like, just curious, what was it about this opportunity that you didn't want to go? And according to Rackman, uh, the response was, "Well, the white people's ice just tastes better. And that's why, you know, that is why I went in this direction, and am not frequenting him." So this idea, though, that as it's told, really is, it's held up as this example of what happens when we don't support each other.
The Bethune Beach is really interesting because before I came to Florida, and looking at Mrs. Bethune, I actually had no idea of, I didn't know about Bethune Beach until I actually came to Florida. And it's such a beautiful space. And when we did the historical marker, there were so many people who came back to that beach and talked about their memories and, just the amazing time that they had. And unfortunately, many people lost that property to taxes and, different things. And so that is a space that I think Mrs. Bethune would not be happy, honestly, with what has happened to that beach. But thankfully, we have the marker, and she is at least recognized as someone who contributed to that site. I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of Pan Africanism. And so, we know a lot about Mrs. Bethune. We know her as an educator. We know her for her work with the Roosevelt administration. We know her as a women's rights activist. We know her for National Council of Negro Women, the organization she started in 1935. We know her as a honorary member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I mean, she is everything to everyone. What we did not know as much about was her international work. And so I was so just amazed by the people who were writing her when I was in the archives, writing her from Haiti, writing her from India, all of these places around the world. And this is really what led to the dissertation and then the book. So I want to just take a second just to talk about how I define Pan-Africanism. The definition is actually taken from Esadebi's text, Pan-Africanism. And so Pan-Africanism is a political and cultural phenomenon which regards Africa, Africans, and African descendants abroad as a unit. It seeks to regenerate and unify Africa and promote a feeling of oneness among the people of the African world. And so it also glorifies the African past, inculcates pride in African values. And so this is how I define Pan-Africanism at the start of the book. And so for me, Mrs. Bethune, she doesn't call herself a Pan-Africanist, right? But a lot of this is really because she had been doing this her whole life. If you know how sometimes we do things and people will say, "Oh, you might be a feminist." And we're like, "Oh, wow, a feminist? You think?" I was just standing up for women's rights. I didn't call myself a feminist, but I had been doing this work the whole time. And so, really, I go back to chapter 1. And she's born in South Carolina in 1875, the 15th of 17 children, and the first of her parents' children to be born into freedom. And so she's born in Maysville, South Carolina. And as a child, she learns a lot about her family history, particularly that her mom's side of the family, that they come from the continent, and there is some royal lineage that they're coming from. So this is what she talks about. And so she talks about being a direct descendant of Africa. And there's a quote where she says, "The drums of Africa still beat in my heart." And so being in South Carolina, I also talk about how this is a very diasporic space. Charleston, the sheer number of African people who come through Charleston during the slave trade, it's almost like for New York and the number of immigrants who come through New York, and the Statue of Liberty and all of those different things we associate with the diversity of New York. And so she talks about South Carolina, its importance, and then you have the Gullah Coast, which is about 100 miles away from Mrs. Bethune. And this is a space in which African people have been able to retain their culture in a number of ways. And then in 1880, you have a census that's taken, and South Carolina had the largest number of children born to African parents. And so there is this huge and influential African presence in South Carolina at the time that Mrs. Bethune is living in the state. And it's also in South Carolina where she meets Reverend John Wesley Bowen, who spoke to her. He came to a church and talked about missionaries, Black missionaries going back to Africa. And so once she heard his speech, she began to think about going to Africa. So she goes to Barbara Scotia College and then Moody Bible College in Chicago. And she actually was supposed to go to Africa as a missionary after she graduated from Moody Bible College, but she was told that they were no longer allowing African Americans to go through this particular program. And so this notion of Pan-Africanism, it often seems like this larger than life idea, but we see it within Mrs. Bethune's work, even from her earlier years. We see those seeds that are being planted in South Carolina. And so throughout the course of her life, she travels to different places. She travels to Haiti in 1949, where she receives the Haitian Medal of Honor and Merit, which is the highest award at that time. And so as she is traveling to these places, she is connecting with people. She is going to orphanages. She is going into churches. She's going to talk to educators, sharing her wisdom about how she started her school. And when she comes back to the States, she writes about these experiences. She was a columnist for the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. And in her writing, she encourages African Americans to visit Haiti, to visit Liberia, to visit the Bahamas, to visit these different places, and not just to go to be to leisurely travel to these places, but to understand and connect with other people of African descent and to really understand each other. And she's really trying to bring about more solidarity between people of African descent in these various places. And she talks about this in The Defender and through her work with NCNW and other organizations.
So one thing I want to add really quickly, Ashley pointed out that she liked to eat. And if she talked more, she would tell you about the Haiti and the cookbook. She wanted everybody to publish cookbooks of Haitian food because she was so taken with it. Uh, and one of the things that I write about, though, is her in fashion. Like she was just a regular folks. She was extraordinary in all kinds of ways, um, and recognizable in others. So one of the things I write about is her love of shoes. She was vain. She had this term. She said she liked to swagger a cane. She didn't have anything wrong with her gait, but she liked the way canes looked. And FDR, when he passed, Eleanor Roosevelt actually gifted her one of FDR's canes. Again, nothing wrong with the way that she was walking at that time. She just like that looks. She liked glasses. She would, before she actually needed glasses, she would wear them because she liked the way they made her look. Um, and she talked about, like some people like smoke cigarettes. I like to swagger a cane. And she had this whole thing about when she was in NACW, uh, coming to understand herself. She was from the country. And a lot of National Association of Colored Women, you're talking about folks who have been trained at the Sorbonne, at Oberlin College, who speak Greek and Latin, who come from people of wealth and influence at that time, many of them. And she didn't. She's the daughter of formerly enslaved people. They sharecrop. They amass land. They earn property, because when freedom comes, they actually work out something with her mother's the former owners, so that they will work. All the children will come back. Um, what is it, 17? She's 15 of 17.
Mhm.
So 17 children and their wives and their babies will come back, and they will work this land living in one structure all together. But every year they'll be able to buy some of it. Right? Like that was the deal that they struck. So that the family would come back together following freedom, which a lot of Black families scattered because folks were
Mhm.
all over the place. And freedom came, and some people want to go up north, some people want to go to southern cities. The first move really is from rural areas to southern cities, and then from southern cities elsewhere. Folks are all over the place. They managed to put out the word for their kids, and say, come
Mhm.
back, bring your people, we're going to work this land, and we will have something. um, that's a noble kind of background, but with the National Council of National Association of Colored Women, again, who are from a very different kind of class background, and actually have all kinds of things that they want to tell working class Black people, rural Black people, people from countries as they're moving to cities. You're going to have to not wear that bonnet on your head when you go outside. You are going to have to not speak so loudly when you're out in public. No one wants you sitting on a porch here up north. We don't act like that. So while there's a lot of uplift, there's a lot of support, founding kindergartens, old folks homes. Uh, there's also a kind of chastising people who don't quite know how to act in these situations. And this is where Bethune comes from. She's Southern. She's in Chicago for a hot minute at the Moody College of Bible, but that's not her milieu, and she never went to any of those schools. A school that wealthy white people and influential white people would send their children for college or universities. She didn't.
Mhm.
She learned to read, but she was 12 the first time she went to school, and learns how to read. And she's learning how to read in a particular Southern system founded after the Civil War that was unequal and uneven, to say the least, just depending on who's in that front of that classroom before you. And so, as you can imagine, she had a little bit of imposter syndrome. While she was impressive to anyone, anytime she opens her mouth, the first time she goes to the National Association of Colored Women clubs in 1918, 17, 18, Mary Church Terrell, who is the president at the time, says, one day you are going to be the president of the
Mhm.
NAC. After she speaks about her school, after she fundraises, after Mary Church Terrell is one day, and she does. 1927, she becomes the president. But but navigating those politics of those club women
Mhm.
is a little piece of what I want to talk about in the book. What I do talk about in the book, because sometimes we can make it sound, or sometimes in talking about freedom, periods of time, and activism, like all Black people think alike and we all like each other. We may be able to figure out how to work together if we need to, but it's not necessarily the case that we all like each other. And when you read the letters that many of these club women were writing about Bethune, they were so snotty about her. I mean,
Mhm.
one of the things that I was shocked by in going in archives and looking at, everybody had some negative to say about her, that she was arrogant, that she was like to try to dominate, or they're in the background, oh, she's trying to start the National Association of uh,
Yes.
NCNW, uh, and of colored women. Um, but we don't, it's gonna fail. It's probably gonna go down the tubes because we done tried this already and we already have things, but let's make her feel okay about it. Like all of these letters have really negative things to say about her regularly. And I try to think about what that must have felt like to her. She didn't
Mhm.
write a lot about it. You know, she wasn't, she wrote a lot of letters. Not a lot of them were casting aspersions on other people, not a lot. But she had to feel a way. as she's coming into political prominence, you start to notice that you can find more. There's not that many photographs of her, but you can find her with hats, kind of experimenting, I think, with a style. The pearls and different necklaces she would wear. And one thing that I think that the statue, the sculptor who did the statue of her that's in Statuary Hall, right? She had the best shoes. They put her in the best shoes. Like she was not opposed to cute shoes. She came out of that experience with a heightened sense of style and presence and understanding about the politics of fashion is the way that I talk about it. That it's not just fashion to make you feel good, fashion to just wear whatever you want whenever you want. Fashion is giving a message to people. It's a narrative about who you are and who you think you are. You can play with it. You can move around, adorn yourselves in different kinds of ways, and it means something. And she absolutely understood it and had to pull that out, though, to navigate some of those class politics and status politics, because she was never, I mean, for her to be working in the White House, again, she couldn't speak Greek and Latin. And the other women who were around are like, how are you getting elevated? We've done all the things that you would expect someone who is of African descent, who's going to rise in this nation. We've gone to the schools. We've traveled to all the countries. We speak the languages. Who is she? Where does she come from? And why are these white people paying her all this mind? So some of some of what she had to navigate is part of what I want to talk about, what I do talk about in the book.
Oh, so many things I want to respond to. But, she didn't have the background. When you look at someone like Mary Church Terrell, whose father was a millionaire, she's working with Mary Church Terrell. When you look at W.E.B. Du Bois, a graduate of Harvard, she's walking alongside these people, working with them to form organizations, and she didn't have any privilege to stand on. She's a dark woman. She's a heavier woman. If you see many of the pictures, she looks very different from the people that she's standing beside. And I credit those early years of being in South Carolina and being grounded in that Pan-Africanism, that knowledge of self, that connection to Africa, that knowing that I am royalty, that knowing that none of my past is an embarrassment. Those are the things that she really takes with her. And it helps her to be confident in spaces where people don't look like her, where people have way more money than she could ever imagine. And she goes and she talks about her school. You should see the letters. I mean, she was writing the New York Times. I mean, writing all of these people, I'm Mary McLeod Bethune. I have a school in Daytona. I mean, the audacity. And she just continues on. And so I think that's part of her secret sauce, is that resilience and that ability to continue to get back up every time. It's so many things that
But
we
let me
could
say,
learn.
let's talk about this too, because we don't talk. I don't think we've never talked about this, but in that Charles Johnson oral history, where Charles Johnson, who's president of Fisk, sociologist, uh, he does an oral history with her. And the story she tells is fascinating to me, because she does talk about the drums of Africa, but she also talks about how everybody always thought she was special, that her mother told her she was special. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how you got 17 brothers and sisters and your mother running around telling you you're special. What did other people think of you? But everyone loved her. The story that she tells him that comes out of this history is really, and she was born with a cowl over her face. Which in some spiritual traditions is about second sight. I mean, it's children who are bought with like the membrane over the face. People will say that means that you W.B. Du Bois was apparently born with a cowl over his face. He's the seventh son of a seventh son. It's a part of how he presents himself as understanding the white world is. He says, I was born like this. She was, but we don't really, I haven't really seen many people talk about her childhood. Where one of the things that she did when she went to school, she says her mother made her promise to come back and teach her brothers and sisters. Like, if you, okay, you're gonna go off to school, because that's a hand in the farm. That's got, like, it's great to send her off to school, but she had to walk a couple miles there, a couple miles back. She was there a good part of the day. That's a person that cannot work at a time when you need hands. Your survival depends on these hands. Is a point where a donkey dies while she's on the farm, and she has to leave school because they need her. They can't. What the donkey did, she has to come back. But she says she was born with a cowl over her face. That everyone always said she was special, and that she grew up believing that she was special. And I always wonder. I just sort of wonder if there's some part of that explains why children were so important to her and why their self-concept. I mean, she was, that was her thing. She was going to make sure that children knew where they came from, who they were, that they had worth, that there were people who had come before, and you need to know them to be inspired so that you can survive the world. You need to understand who you are and who you came from. And I do sort of wonder, like, is it because she was poured into, she was picked up, allowed to go to school, allowed to get a scholarship so she could go to the next school. At every place she went, her teachers uh, would say they had never had anyone like her, give her every kind of opportunity. She had everyone saw something special in her and tried to cultivate it, even when she was barefoot running around, South Carolina. And I wonder if that could be a basis for her love of children.
So I definitely think that the early years and um, people pouring into her is what gave her that sense of responsibility to do the same for others. And so, this idea of not for myself, but for others, it was very strong in her mindset. And she was thinking about the next generation. This is what I've been trying to stress to the students, is that Miss Bethune was thinking about you. She talked about young people constantly. She started a school, for God's sakes, for children. Started as an all-girls school, and also she taught her son. But she was always pulling young people in. She was bringing them to NCNW. She was bringing them into everything that she did. And even in her later years, she loved to celebrate her birthday. Her birthday was a big deal. She would always get a big cake. It's like a tiered cake. I've seen her do the tiered cake, and there were children, just children hanging out with her for her birthday. And so she was always thinking about young people, because she always said that they would be the ones that would inherit the world. And so, how are we building them up? How are we passing the torch? How are we preparing things so that it can be easier for them? And so, when you look at the statue that she has in Lincoln Park, her last will and testament, in which she talks about leaving love, leaving a respect for the use of power, leaving knowledge, all of these things. The statue depicts her passing the torch. She's passing that last will and testament on to two young people who are holding their hands out. And so she builds up so many young people around her, so many people who came after her, talk about just how she was so special and how she poured into them. And even when she would see young people out in public, everybody talks about her putting their hand on her, and she would speak positive to them. She would say, "You're going to go great places," or "You're going to do great things." I mean, so many people have talked about that story. Howard Thurman even said that she put her hand on him when he was a little kid, and how they really respected her in the community. And her school was not just for the students, but she opened it up to other children in the community. She opened her library up at a time when African Americans couldn't go to other libraries. She opened it to all children in the Daytona Beach community. She had a story hour time where they could come and read and learn. So she was always invested in young people because she understood that they would be the ones to continue the legacy after she was gone. And so I think that's definitely a lesson for all of us too, to not get so busy that we forget young people, because she was cultivating the next generation that would come after her, and it was always on her mind.
Should we open up for questions? I think because Ashley and I will sit up here and tell you stories about Miss Bethune until I'll
All
be sitting
day.
here, the sun going down.
Talking about whatever.
Wait for the mic so we can get you for our television audience. Just a second, let me bring this to you. No, we have people online. We want to make sure they can hear you.
You said a cow over the face. I've never heard that term before. You saying COW, cow?
I'm sorry.
Cow.
Yeah,
Cow?
it's like when you're born with it's a part of, I don't know what part of the body is. It's the placenta that's over your face when
Right.
you're born. And yeah, people sometimes ascribe spiritual kind of abilities and insight to that.
Okay.
But yeah, it was just the
So
face
I
is
was
covered.
on Jacksonville Beach before, and I met a elderly lady that had extremely long locks,
Yes.
and she
Nadine.
stays in a trailer on the.
Yeah.
Do y'all have any knowledge
Yes,
of her?
Nadine. Yeah. She is the beach. Oh, I'm sorry. She's known as the beach lady, but she's actually Maveen Betch is her name, and she's Jonetta Cole's younger. Was it younger or older? It was Jonetta Cole's sister. I just right now can't remember if it's her younger or older sister. She'd been an opera singer in the 1930s. Professor Cole's family legacy and history really is a story that needs telling. It's sprawling and inspirational in a different kind of way. So Maveen, though, she came back, took care of her mother, and became very invested in the Nana, the dune, a sand dune that is at American Beach. And she's gotten this thing. Before she passed sometime. It's been at least a decade. She got this thing on the National Park Service. It is now protected. It protects against erosion. There's some sea turtles there. Like, she was waging war for these turtles in this sea dune. She lived there she actually told me once, I think I told you my grandparents own property there, and she used to live in a trailer. But when it got cold, because we were never there, my father and I, by the time we had the beach house, I was a graduate student and he was in Clearwater more, so we weren't there very much. So Maveen used to stay in the house just because it was sitting there. And she told me once, there's American Beach has a street named Mary Street. And just chatting with her, when I was like, well, who is it for? She was like, it could be for my mother, Mary. It could be for Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune used to be at American Beach regularly. She helped to found the beach. She actually got Truman to gift 100 acres of beachfront land to A.L. Lewis. One researcher found, digging around in documents underneath the courthouse in Clearwater, in Fernandina Beach, and found the deed signed by Harry Truman. Mary McLeod Bethune got, somehow, this was federal land, I think from Sherman's Field Order 15, that folks had not come back. Y'all know the Sea Islands, after the war, General Sherman said 40 acres and a mule. So he was he by himself, given no authority other than the fact that he was a general, just jumped up one day and said, here's what we need to do. We need to give them like 40 acres. And then later there was another order where he said, and they need some way to work this land. And the Sea Islands from South Carolina end right at American Beach. They end a few miles south. Amelia Island is the farthest south of these Sea Islands. So this was all federal land that was supposed to be returned to the former owners and the people who rose up, took arms against. But this 100 acres, for some reason, was never returned to anyone, right? And I don't know why. I just haven't had time to figure out why not. Why didn't anybody come back and claim it? And in the 1940s, Mrs. Bethune was able to get Truman to give it to her. And Maveen would tell you chapter and verse about Mrs. Bethune on those in American Beach for a good long time.
And I just want to add, I've recently gone to the museum. There's a museum that interprets the history of American Beach, and they have there on display the hair from the beach lady. They've taken her dreadlocks and made an installation of it there. So if you're ever in that area, people can go and see it.
They were massive.
She would have to
And
carry
her
them.
nails were like feet long and started to curl back on themselves. Yeah, yeah.
Any
She has a
other
vision.
questions from the audience for our speakers? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, just first of all, I want to say thank you so very much for coming and doing this presentation about Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. I happen to be a graduate of Bethune-Cookman back in the 60s, and I'm very proud to be, an alumni of that university. You've just shared so many things that I didn't know about her, and I just, just so good to hear these things that you're talking about. Her theme was slogan was enter to learn, depart to serve, and so I do remember that above everything else, and so again, just really impressed with all that you're presenting. My question is. She was, as you already illustrated, she's a very, very special woman. And sounds like to me she was not just special, but she was sent from God. I happen to be a minister, okay, by the way. And sound to me, all the things that you're describing about her, she's definitely was a woman that was sent from God. I believe this is why she had all the special privileges and opportunities that were presented to her, because she was definitely a woman of God. And I believe this is why a lot of the women, not only women, but a lot of the people that were criticizing her, okay, and condemning her for the opportunities that was presented her, I believe that they were, like I say, jealous and couldn't understand, why was these doors opening for her and we've done they haven't opened for us. So just talk more about her spiritual life, if you would, and her spiritual qualifications, and just how connected she was to God, and how do you believe that what I'm saying is true, that she was doors were open divinely for her because she was so close to God, and others didn't get the same opportunities.
One thing I will say, there are two things I want to say real fast. One is, Mrs. Bethune is someone who I marvel at regularly, that people who know her are they about it, right? Like they are like, come on now. But so many people just don't. And I sometimes wonder, what do you have to do as a Black woman to be remembered? Like when you hear everything that she did over decades, how she moved, she's part of the reason we had the Tuskegee Airmen, right? I mean, she's founds the UNCF, or creates the conditions for UNCF to be founded, a United Negro College Fund. She was the president of the Urban League. She was vice president of the NAACP. Not to mention the organization she herself founded, like anything having to do with Black freedom and civil rights. In that interwar period, it is not an exaggeration to say you will find her if you look. For every organization, every person of significance. She hires Zora Neale Hurston to start the first theater arts program at a HBCU. She had Zora Neale Hurston to do it. You know, she and Langston Hughes were running buddies. She was his long-term mentor. He talks about how he would not have embraced poetry if she had not told him, you know, this is something that you can do. When he was at Lincoln, what do you have to do to be remembered? Again, those of us who know her and start researching her, we will sit up here all day and give you chapter and verse. But there's so many folks who just don't, and that's a conundrum to me. The thing about her being, she is a woman of faith. You cannot understand Mary McLeod Bethune if you discount her relationship to children, her relationship to education, or her relationship to God. You have fundamentally misrepresented her. She was spiritual in all kinds of ways, but she was a woman of faith. And she was evangelical about Black freedom. So as she told you, you know, she wanted to go be a missionary when she graduated from the Moody, right? Yeah. And the Methodists are like, we don't send Black people to Africa. Like, what are you thinking? Like, that's not the model that we're going for. And she accepted it. It was a hard, you know, because she had, since the drums of Africa were beating in her soul from as a young child, she had wanted to go to Africa, but she accepted it. But she pivoted and became someone who was evangelical about Black people and Black freedom in relationship to God. It was always in relationship to, and she was she learned to profess in a certain way. So when she was in Chicago, they just told her, just go out places and be like, just preach, you know, bring people. So she's like in Chicago again, from the South, from the country, and she's going into bars. She did not frequent urban bars, like, you know, and trying to talk to people about bringing their life and their souls to God. There's at least one story that I read that really sounded a little scary. Like, people had to help her get out because folks were, yeah, I mean, they were drunk. They were not there for it at that time. But she knocked on doors in the Chicago suburbs. It just sort of said, "We want to talk to you about God." On one occasion, a young white girl was kind of like, you know, the mother invited Ms. Bethune in to eat with them while they were going to talk about God, and she could ask her questions. And the little girl was like, "But mama, but you know, she's still dirty, you know, like she got to wash up. Her skin's still Black." And the way that she told the story, she was just kind of like, and it was so cute, and kept it moving. But she cut her teeth about how to talk to people, how to inspire, how to make an argument, how to raise people up, because she was learning how to preach. So I don't know if God made her who she was. I mean, obviously, but I know that her faith, you cannot understand her at all if you don't understand her faith. I'm sorry, I kept talking.
No, you're good. A quote from Mrs. Bethune: "Faith is the first factor in a life devoted to service." Faith. So she talks a lot about her faith, and we see her exercising her faith. I've literally had people to ask me, like, what was her secret sauce? Like, how in the world? And I always go back to that quote: faith. Her faith in God. And she also talks about faith in herself, that she could do it. And so we see, yeah, I'm going to talk about that. And so you see her, if you go into her home, whenever they open her home back up, her home, if you look at her desk, they have the daily bread, and then they have the Bible. And Miss Senorita Locklear, who was her last secretary, worked with her for the last year of her life. She's 100 years old. She said that every day before they started work, they will always pray, read the daily bread, do a daily devotional, and that's how they started the day. We didn't start with any business first. We start with giving God the glory, and that's how she was starting her day. And this is with her secretary. And so we see her not committing, but we see her engaging with Presbyterians. We see her school is a Methodist a church. We see all of these different affiliations for Mrs. Bethune, but ultimately, I think it was her personal connection with God. She many times is joining these different religious affiliations because of the resources or because of the things that she's doing at that time. But I can't say that she was committed to any particular denomination, but more so committed to God himself. And so we see that throughout her work. I mean, she's always talking about God and her faith. I mean, there's no separation. And I would also argue that, that way that she's able to preach and minister to people and relate to people, that's what makes her different from some of the other folks. Because she can talk to everyday people. She can talk to folks not just at a high level, but she can get down and make things, talk about things in a way that folks can understand them. And that's the kind of stuff, as you know, you get that through the ministry. And so it was all over her for sure.
I just want to add on to that. I did a number of oral histories in where I was raised in North Florida, Madison County, Suwannee County, and the like. And there were a number of graduates of Bethune-Cookman that I spoke to. And one of the things that I found surprising, and these are separate interviews for people that went to that school and had a chance to know her, see her on campus, they spoke so highly of the fact that it did not matter what shade of Black you were. She treated you all the same. And you have to understand, as was referenced in your talk, the extent of colorism at that point. We had brown paper bag tests that Black people were giving each other, right? If you were lighter than the brown paper bag, you had access. You had privilege in the community. But if you were darker skinned, like Mary McLeod Bethune, it meant exclusion. It meant being overlooked. And people really were impacted by that. And that always stayed with me. I have a question that I wanted to follow up. And yes, it did take a really long time for her to be recognized, but she has, at long last, been recognized in a major way. I wonder if the two of you could talk about the journey to getting this beautiful sculpture of Mary McLeod Bethune in Statuary Hall.
Yeah. So I always have to start with giving credit to Florida, to the people of Florida, particularly those wildcats. Because at the time in 2015-16, when they were talking about replacing General Edmund Kirby, who had been a Confederate general, his statue was in Statuary Hall. And so, as you know, there has been a movement across the United States to remove these Confederate symbols in different places. And so when they tossed around the idea of possibly removing the Confederate symbol that stood in Statuary Hall, representing Florida, Mrs. Bethune's name overwhelmingly came to the top. She had about 1,200, I wrote it down. I think it was like 1,200 votes out of 3,000. She had the most votes of anyone. And so in 2016, you had an ad hoc committee that came together in Tallahassee to make the decision on whether or not, even after her overwhelmingly getting the most votes throughout the states, they wanted to come together to kind of talk about whether or not she would be the person to get it. And she was actually up against, I cannot remember his name, but I'm sure y'all will help me, Floridians, the founder of Publix. Jenkins, is that his name? Publix, yes. That was the other person that they were really considering, even though he didn't have nearly as many votes as Mrs. Bethune. So I, at the time, was working for Bethune-Cookman University, and we all went up to do our testimonies to talk about, the work that she'd done in Florida, her work with the Roosevelts and all of these things to kind of give them a sense of why she deserved this. And so that process from 2016, and it wasn't until 2022 that statue was placed. Bethune-Cookman and several people from the community led fundraising efforts. While I was a professor at Bethune, We wrote state representatives talking about, why she deserved the statue. I mean, I had students like, I need you to write this essay, and we're putting it in a manila folder and we are mailing it off. And so it was very much the efforts of Bethune-Cookman and a lot of great Floridians who wanted to see Mrs. Bethune in that space and wanted Florida to get on the right side of history. And so I think it's amazing. And so her statue was placed in Statuary Hall in 2022. And recently we have Daisy Bates, who worked with the Little Rock Nine from Arkansas. She has been placed in Statuary Hall. So even in death, Mrs. Bethune is still making waves and making room for other people to come after her. And you'll see even more states that will begin to place African Americans in Statuary Hall. This is significant because when you walk around Statuary Hall, and I challenge you, if you go to DC, please go to the Capitol at some point. It's an awesome space. But you see all of these states and who they have representing them. She is the first African American to represent a state, the first African American. And who these states have representing them says a lot about that state. And so I was really glad to see Florida doing this and seeing her there in the Capitol where she belongs. I mean, she did so many great things in Washington, D.C. You have her home. You have Lincoln Park, where there's a memorial dedicated to her. And so to have her in this very important space, I think it speaks to the history that we need to be telling in this moment in time.
Any other questions from the audience? And I see your hand here. Come.
Hi. A few years ago, like around 2017, I don't know if you know about it, the Wax Museum in Maryland, Baltimore, they had a numerous amount of African American figures, Barack Obama, but they also had Mary McLeod Bethune, and they had her last will and testament. And I have it here, but I don't want to read the thing. So maybe you want to read it?
It's actually, it's very long and it's in the book.
It's her last will and testament. It's in this museum, and it talks about how she wants to leave the world, what she wanted to leave, her legacy. And in it, she says she's leaving it to the youth because they are our future. I just wanted to share that.
And I'm a professor, so I'm going to give everyone that homework to read the last will and testament. It's a powerful document, and I think it really shows her philosophies and her ideas, and it gives us all something to think about. We think about wills, we want houses and cars and money and all of that, but she's leaving behind so many things that people can't buy. Like love,
Power,
like hope,
respect for the uses of power,
brotherhood,
Come on.
things that we need right now.
It's like she was reading my mind. So my question is about your class that you mentioned, and you all, in your own way, right, are moving forward with her legacy. But could you talk a little bit about how you came up with this class and how your students are perceiving it, right? And do they know who she is, right? I think the only reason I know I grew up in Florida is because my friends went to Bethune-Cookman. If not, I was never taught here about her. So I'm wondering, are you teaching it at Howard or Brown or both?
So,
Both?
yeah,
Okay.
so it's a unique class. Like I think we're going to do this again. So we're teaching it between Brown and Howard. One day a week we meet in person, but we use technology so we can see we're all in our separate places. But we can see the students do presentations together. They ask questions. We do one from Brown, one from Howard for asking questions. So you get a sense that day you get to see their face. And then the second day, on Thursdays, we tend to have scholars who come in who have written about Mrs. Bethune. We had Tara White this last week. We've had Stephanie Evans. We have all kinds of folks who come in. And that day is we're all on Zoom, so we can share presentations. And then they're doing, I'll let Ashley talk about the projects that they're doing, because in addition to engaging scholars, hearing us talk, them coming up with their own things. The Brown Center for Digital Scholarship, I think that's what they're called, is providing us support to teach our students some technology. They're going to use a program called Scalar that allows for multimedia production of digital texts. And Brown is there at the kind of forefront of this in a scholarly, that's where actually Ashley and I met. She was doing a project there for 2021, I think. And I dropped in at the Center for Digital Scholarship. So yeah, then in addition to everything that they're learning about the past, we're asking them to think about the now and the future and to use these digital tools to tell stories.
And so far, one of the first things they had to do was a project where they identified the modern Mary McLeod Bethunes. Like, who are people that you see as carrying the torch of Mrs. Bethune's work? And they selected, many of the folks they selected were educators, state senators. I mean, some of the folks I actually don't know, which I loved. People in their communities who are leading organizations. And so that was one of the first projects. The end project is going to be a collaborative effort. So all of the students, they have to group up. We're looking at her work in education. We're looking at her work with women. So we have 5 different segments of her work. And then they are writing essays. They're going to be pulling photos. They're also going to do a spoken word, and it's not a spoken word as in a poem, but they have to record themselves talking about what Mrs. Bethune means to them. And so what we're really seeking to do is to bring Mrs. Bethune into the 21st century and to show young people that she is relevant to their lives and that they're standing upon her shoulders. And so far, the students have been doing wonderful. I mean, they are really energized. I think many of them are just in disbelief that they
Never knew.
didn't know all. They're like, why don't many, once you get the Bethune bug, I call it, once you get that bug, you're like, I can't believe people don't know her. I have to tell someone. And so the great thing about the project is that at the end, we'll have a site that we can share with people. So you'll get to see the students' work. You'll get to see some of the photos and things that they'll find, hear their voices, hear their thoughts on Mrs. Bethune, and also see who they have determined to be the modern Mary McLeod Bethunes who are in amongst us. So.
Dr. Rooks, Dr. Preston, I cannot thank you enough for coming to be with us from Howard University, from Brown University, down here to little old Arlick. So thank you for blessing us today. You can hang tight. I want to make sure we get our photo out before you take off. Again, I want to thank our audience for being here, both in person and online. I want to take an opportunity to just make a few announcements. We will be back in this space tomorrow at 2 p.m. We will be concluding with the 4th installment of our Race and Justice documentary series. It's been really wonderful so far. The film that we'll be showing tomorrow is Raising Liberty Square. How many folks in here got roots in Miami, connections to Miami? It's always somebody down here, even if we're Fort Lauderdale, who have connections there. But it's dealing with issues of climate gentrification. And this is really real. We just survived. We were fortunate to miss the direct hit with Hurricane Helene. But as sea levels continue to rise and the oceans gets hotter, there is a real contest about who's going to live where. And there are many Black neighborhoods that are on higher level that are now being encroached upon and gentrified. And that is really the subject matter of this film. One of the main protagonists in that film, as well as a ongoing climate activist, Valencia Gunder, will be here after the film to talk with the audience. So if you can make it tomorrow at 2 p.m., you can be here with us to conclude that. Next week is a very busy week here. It's all about films. We have a couple of other film engagements engagements, on Thursday, we will have the privilege of hosting the Black Travel Summit, which will be in Fort Lauderdale the 10th, 11th, and 12th. They're going to be here with a film festival on Thursday, so you can come back and be here with us for that. Or you can Google their website, Black Travel Summit, to find out more information and for tickets. That is a ticketed event. But next Saturday, we are really excited. We have some folks coming in from LA who are partnering with us to put on our very first Afro-Latino short film competition. So we're partnered with the Latino Entertainment Journalists Association, as well as the African American Film Critics Association. It's being presented by Lexus, and we are hosting. And so we're very excited. From 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., we'll be here. You'll be able to see some of the films that were submitted, see the award winners. There's a slate of celebrity judges that will be here. There'll be food and entertainment. So please, if you're not going to Juve, you can come and be here with us. So there's a lot going on. These are just the tip of the iceberg for the product programs that we have going on here at ARLIC. There are flyers in our lobby, but I'm really proud to share with you that we now have a new outlet for people to find out what we're doing here at ARLIC. We have a Facebook page, y'all. Yeah, it may not seem like a lot, but you don't understand county government if you don't understand what a triumph this is. So you can follow us at facebook.com/ARLIC, AARLCC, and find out more about news and events that we have going on. So super excited. Please follow us, tell a friend, and we hope that you will come back and be with us. Right now, we have a couple of opportunities. I'm going to shout out Akbar and Denise with Pyramid Books. They are here, and you can purchase your copies of Dr. Preston and Dr. Rooks's books before you leave and get those autographed for your bookshelves. And we also have a reception. And so we hope that you will stay and hang and socialize with us for a little bit. But thank you again, doctors. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Yeah, I didn't know she wanted us.